Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We will give everyone a few minutes to log in and get settled, and then we will start very soon.
Okay, so I think I'll go ahead and get us started off here, if that's okay. It's a minute after, and somebody joins in a minute or two, they won't miss much. I'm just going to welcome everybody. I want to thank everybody for being on the call today. We appreciate that very much. We think we have some good information to share. For those of you I may not know, my name is Mike Buckington. I'm the CEO of MI2. And today we are pleased to be able to hear from Hunter and Irina, work for Ankura, and I'll let them introduce themselves, but certainly they have expertise and have spent a lot of time in an environment that we're not very familiar in. And so I think it will you will find it very valuable and beneficial to get some updates on the last 2 or 3 weeks or so of lots of activity and how it may affect us in different ways. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to them. And I hope everybody enjoys the webinar today. Thank you very much. And I'll turn it over to Hunter and Irina.
Thanks, Mike. Went ahead and pulled the presentation up. Hopefully you guys can see it. Appreciate the introduction. I'll go through just broader introduction of Ankura for those who haven't heard of us. It's a newer consulting firm founded in 2014 and has grown really quickly over the past 10 years. Going from one consultant and founder to now 2,000 people with 35 offices around the world. We play in a lot of traditional consulting verticals, whether it's turnaround and restructuring, general advisory work, and the like. Irina and myself, we sit in Washington, D.C., and I lead our work in all federal incentives, state incentives, grants, contracts, and loans. And Irina works with me in that practice, but also supports clients in engaging with Capitol Hill and elected officials, which Irina, I didn't mean to take your introduction, but maybe if you wanted to introduce yourself, we can go from there.
Sure, thank you. Welcome everybody to the webinar and thank you for joining us. My name is Irina Emerson, and as Hunter said, my experience comes from working with Congress to represent different clients, mostly in the funding realm. I work with either congressional spending, congressionally directed spending, or federal funding, making sure that the programs our clients benefit from have enough funding, or any kind of legislative language where we can improve our clients' position to benefit from federal investment. I started my career over 20 years ago here in Washington, and what I have found is that, of course, it's always helpful to know what is going on, but it's even more helpful to know why things are happening and what are some of the political undercurrents, and how we can strategically position our clients and our interest groups to benefit from those political undercurrents. So with that, that's what we're going to focus on today, is what is going on here and why it's happening and how we can use the situation to the benefit of the metals industry for your purposes. And Hunter, I'm ready to jump into the overview if you want to.
Yeah, before we move on, I do want to add, over the last year, we got $700 million in federal funding for clients, and we have projects all across the United States, all the way from Oregon to Alabama. We have done a number of metals projects in copper, aluminum. We also have projects in the critical mineral space, so very familiar with the area and are closely following the legislation and regulatory movements and how they'd impact those industries. So we'll obviously focus on that today, but also we'll focus on Kentucky as a state more broadly. But feel free We will be sharing this presentation to everyone at the end, and it is a lot of materials, and we'll be talking over it. It is meant to be a reference material for you guys to come back to after we share it around. But feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and we are going to take those and answer them one by one at the end. But just hold your questions, or put your questions in the chat, but hold any vocal questions until we get to the very end. And last thing to go over before we get into it is the Ankura is not a accounting firm, nor are we a law firm. Arena and myself are not accountants or lawyers, so we cannot provide tax or legal advice. Obviously, when we're talking about policy and regulation, it might be construed as that, but we're just giving you our best analysis as we can based off of our experience with projects, working with the administration and working with Congress on policy, but also as we're working on projects with our clients. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Arena to kick us off on the meat of the presentation.
Thanks, Hunter. So just to go over what to expect in this webinar, what we're going to cover, we're going to talk about the new political environment we have here following the November election, and kind of how that plays into President Trump and the White House using presidential actions to drive the agenda. We will specifically focus on presidential actions that affect the metals industry. And then we'll talk about what to expect next in terms of some of the items that Congress has to address and some of the items we expect coming out of just in general in Washington. And then we will actually use our recommendations throughout the presentation so we can address any kind of specific interest areas that you may have. And after that, we'll have a Q&A session, as Hunter said, from the chat, and hopefully you'll find it helpful. So let's just jump right in. So new political environment in Washington following the election. We have the new president in the White House. Of course, he's not new. He has returned, and both President Trump and his team are very much prepared. They have been working on the agenda for the past 4 years, and he certainly has not wasted any time getting in there and starting to implement some of the things that he has talked about on the campaign trail. And he actually also has the benefit of what we call government trifecta. And that is what we call a situation when both the Senate and the House are also have the majority from the same party. And that is very important because on the surface, that allows for an easier passage of any kind of political or campaign priorities that the parties come into Washington with. Now, when I say on the surface, it is because how wide or narrow those majorities are actually very significant to how things can get done. And I want to talk about each chamber specifically. In the Senate, we have 53 Republican majority, which is kind of in line with what we have been seeing in the past couple of election cycles. It is well short of the 60 votes that are needed to not have to worry about a filibuster, but it is a majority and it allows them to lose a couple of votes if they had to. And it is a comfortable majority. The House is a completely different story. The House actually has a very narrow majority for Republicans. It's only 2 votes. It actually was 5 votes after the November election, but 3 members were nominated to serve in the administration. So therefore, their seats are open. Actually, 1 seat is not yet open. It's Congresswoman Elise Stefanik. She's leaving any day. So I just, for sake of discussion, I counted her as an open seat. But these are safe Republican seats. They're not going to turn to Democrats. However, they're open right now. So they don't have a member voting in them. And they will stay open until about April or May. So that means in the next 2 months, Speaker Johnson has very few votes to lose. And we will come back to this point as we're talking about different issues that we think are interesting for your industry. But the point here is very, very narrow majority makes it very difficult to pass legislation. Okay, Hunter, we are ready. So let's talk about, kind of zoom in more to Kentucky, more closer, all politics is local, and talk about the Kentucky delegation. Of course, you all know that Kentucky has had a very powerful, very effective congressional delegation, and it will continue to be so. Senator McConnell is no longer the Republican leader, of course, but he is still there, and he's still there in a very, very powerful position as the chair of Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. And I want to kind of take 2 seconds to talk about the Appropriations Committee. That is both in the House and in the Senate, that is the most coveted assignment for any member. It is, of course, the committee that enables all policy written by all the other committees to actually be enacted. It allows for budgets to enact those laws. And of course, it also has a huge say in the funding, the federal funding that goes back to the communities. And Kentucky has greatly benefited from having Mitch McConnell there. Also, Congressman Hal Rogers from the 5th District of Kentucky in the eastern part of the state also is a chair of a different subcommittee. Again, a very highly coveted role. He is very senior. He's actually the Dean of the House of Representatives, which is kind of a ceremonial role. It's reserved for a member who is the longest serving sitting member of Congress. But it just shows that he has a lot of seniority and is in excellent position to help the state. For the sake of brevity for this webinar, as well as the slide, we did not include any other members from the congressional delegation, but I do want to emphasize that it is a great delegation, and as we will talk more as we go through the issues through these slides, we will encourage you to work with your congressional delegation and advocate for yourself through them. And the delegation is there to help you. They're in a good position. And of course, we're focused today in our conversation on the federal affairs, but I would be amiss to not mention Governor Andy Beshear. Of course, he's a Democratic sitting governor. He will be the governor until the end of 2027. He is widely seen as the rising star of the Democratic Party, a potential presidential contender. And that issue may it will play somewhat into how the administration is dealing with the state. But again, like I said, we want to talk about the federal efforts here. And so, Hunter, why don't we go ahead and talk about the issues that the Republican, we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have House, Senate, and the White House are in the Republican hands. So what we are seeing is the shift in policy priorities to things that are more near and dear to the Republican heart. And we have selected several of those issues that we think are most important and most interesting to this audience. And we'll start with the energy issue. Of course, the president is calling it Unleashing American Energy. He's been talking about, he'd say, drill, baby, drill. Those are his words. That is a priority of the Republican Party. That is the priority of the new president. It is overtaken the priority of the previous administration, which focused more on renewable energy, clean energy, and environmental protections. Another issue, of course, that is coming up is the American First trade policy, tariffs. We're going to jump right in here in a little bit, talk about tariffs, very important issue. Tariffs are interesting in the political space because they actually defy traditional party lines. And some of the members of each party kind of tend to have their own opinions based on the industry they represent in their districts, but we're definitely seeing that push from the president. Another issue that we will see come up in this administration and in this Republican Congress is that the regulatory environment is going to take a back seat to the importance of environmental protections that the Democrats have been spearheading. There will be several executive orders that we're going to talk about today later in this webinar that actually are doing away with the environmental protections or superseding the environmental protections that the previous administrations have put into place. And then, of course, we have the issue of budget and tax cuts versus the Democratic idea of federal spending and investment. We're seeing the new administration is much more interested in again, having smaller government, letting the market, the free market, and the communities kind of do their own thing as opposed to having government intervention. Whereas previously, what we are coming from is the idea of of the federal government heavily investing to spearhead some of the development. Hunter, do you want to touch base on how this affects our audience?
Yeah. So, broadly speaking, and this was something we'll dive deep to in each executive order and what those specifically mean for you. But broadly speaking, there's a lot of headlines going on about the pause in federal grants and funding that the Trump administration has done, and the number of executive orders that he's passing, the shifting in priorities, tariffs, trade, and I think lost in the noise in that is that federal funding and opportunities, whether they be grants, loans, tax credits, those are things that Trump used in his first term and is likely to continue to use them moving forward. They are conducting the pause now to rescind and pause some funding and programs, but those aren't going away anytime soon. It's just a matter of Trump's alignment to the funding to his priorities. And we believe in something we'll get a double click on later, that is a strong upside for metals companies, particularly in the state of Kentucky. Obviously, with the tariff, recent tariffs announced even this morning and late last night, there's a lot of uncertainty around supply chain, a lot of volatility. We do expect that countries are going to respond in kind. There'll be a tit for tat tariff and trade battle. So that is something that we're watching closely for clients, helping them navigate that and understand that. And then obviously for the decreased regulation, that's great upside for all companies as they're looking at pursuing different projects. The Trump administration has shown its intention and willingness to use federal lands to support the private sector more openly than the Biden administration has done in the past, particularly as it pertains to unleashing American energy. But within the unleashing American energy, again, something we'll double click on later, they have highlighted the role of critical minerals and metals within that. So I think that while everybody's focused on natural gas and drill baby drill, there are opportunities that are lost in those headlines for metal companies to pursue down the line. But really what you can do, and we'll have one of these for every slide of what it means for you and what to do now. What we're advising all of our clients today, especially those that have contracts, grant agreements with the federal government, is to align your project to the Trump administration's priorities. So what we say often is that when submitting for grant applications and loans under the Biden administration, we always highlighted the emissions reduction potential and the implications for climate change and things of that nature. Obviously, those concerns take a back seat for the Trump administration. I'd say they're still important, especially as we're installing innovative technologies and processes to reduce emissions. But the main concern for the Trump administration is supply chain resiliency, production capacity, jobs, and the economic impact as opposed to reducing emissions. So these key terms, unleashing American energy, America first supply chains, onshoring critical minerals, onshoring metals processing, those are all things that you see littered throughout President Trump's executive orders. And we're recommending all of our clients to advocate for their projects on the merits of it and aligning and highlighting how that aligns. Whereas our application materials 2 or 3 years ago, may have focused on the emissions, like I said, but if you change it to focus on the Trump administration's priorities, that will help you as you're engaging with them moving forward. Obviously, with the volatility, conducting a supply chain review and assessment is critical, and then identifying regulatory challenges and engaging with your officials to raise awareness on those challenges. Trump recently, and this is something that he had a 2-to-1 executive order where he said that there must be 2 regulations rescinded or removed before 1 regulation is installed. Now he's bumped that up to 10-to-1. And so I think they're going to be hard pressed to find 10 regulations to remove to enact a new one. So they certainly need industry's help to highlight where there are challenges, and that presents opportunities for everyone on this call. Real quickly, I just wanted to go through what is a presidential action. One thing, again, lost in headlines, people often use executive order as a broad brushstroke for what the Trump administration is doing. But in reality, there are 3 main kinds of presidential actions. Each of them have different implications. Each of them should be understood differently. And I think knowing what is what whenever they are announced will help you think about what's to come and, maybe how long the legal challenge or processes might be. So an executive order, again, is a broad term that most people use. That is an official presidential action. Um, it is the most formal of presidential action. And as soon as it is passed or signed by President Trump, it must be published in the Federal Register. It must also cite the legal or constitutional authority that justifies the executive order, and can be rescinded by courts if not consistent with law, and is frequently challenged in the courts as we're seeing today. Um, Historically, they have been used to executive orders have been used to overturn or rescind executive orders from previous administrations, or express a policy priority for the administration, or order specific action, a broad specific action for all agencies within the executive branch to take. Trump, really across all three of these categories, is using each of these actions in unique ways. And that's something that he did in his first term and is only going to continue to double down on that in this term. But generally speaking, the executive orders that he's used have still applied to broad interagency policy reforms or initiatives. And, for example, if they are installing a policy or getting rid of an executive order from the previous administration that applies to all agencies, he will typically do that through executive order. These have been the easiest or quickest to challenge from a legal perspective. And there's a difference of opinion in why. Again, we're not lawyers. A lot of it, they note that having to cite the legal or constitutional authority in the executive order takes more time for the administration to prepare them, but at the same time also gives lawyers who are challenging it a legal basis at which to attack it. So when you see an announcement of a true bona fide executive order, that's something to keep in mind, especially given that some of these are being challenged in the courts as we speak. And just a couple of historical examples for you. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order, and the Equal Employment Opportunity was an executive order under President Obama. Moving on to the second category, presidential memorandums, and this category, and I would say the last category, proclamations, is something that Trump has turned to use much more aggressively than previous administrations. So memorandums are less formal than executive orders and are not required to cite their legal or constitutional authority, and are not required to be published in the Federal Register once they are signed. They often are, because they are, if it is a substantial impact or to industry or regulatory authority, they will need to be published, but there is a bit of a lag when memorandums are signed to when they're published in the Federal Register. Trump has used these, or historically, they have been used to direct agencies to study an issue, delay policies, or order a specific action by a specific branch or select few agencies. So not a broad all agency action, but just directing a handful, one or two or three specific agencies to do an action. Trump has used these more frequently and more aggressively than previous administrations. And some have posited that it's likely because they're easier to do. You don't have to cite the legal authority or constitutional authority. So if once Trump makes a decision, they can quickly spin up a memorandum. But oftentimes he will start with a memorandum to announce a policy or announce a position from the administration that will later turn into an executive order or proclamation. So one of them that we will get into later would be the America First trade policy. That technically was a memorandum that requires agencies to conduct studies of trade policies that will later turn into other trade actions through forms of proclamation or executive orders. A good example of how Trump's used it in the past was he did use the memorandum to support the Keystone Pipeline and other pipeline projects. We do expect that to be another thing that he will do in this administration. But another famous example is DACA under President Obama. That was under memorandum as well. Turning to proclamations, and I think many of you saw the recently announced steel and aluminum tariffs. So that was done under proclamation. These are closer to presidential memorandums in the sense that they don't have to cite their legal or constitutional authority. Traditionally, proclamations were only used for things like announcing National History Months or national holidays, or putting flags at half staff for in remembrance. Um, if, for example, the President Lincoln was the original Thanksgiving proclamation, and partner Richard Nixon was done under proclamation as well. Trump has now used these more aggressively with tariffs. Like I said earlier, the aluminum tariff was done under proclamation. Again, likely because they are easier for Trump to develop. Whenever he makes a decision, he can do it under proclamation, and they don't have to go through the legal process of defining the legal and constitutional authority. Maybe last thing I'd add is memorandums and proclamations can be challenged in the courts, and they are today. We're already seeing that. They have proven to be a little bit more durable. Again, just and going through the courts and citing the constitutional authority versus executive power. So, broadly speaking, what I would say and how we think about it is Trump will use a memorandum to announce studies or interagency work that will lay the groundwork for later executive orders or proclamations. And he will move quicker on proclamations based off if he says something in a interview that he's likely to do, he will likely pursue that under proclamation or memorandum. And then executive orders are more wide sweeping orders. And then on the back half of that, executive orders, he often uses those for campaign promises who maybe he doesn't care as much about them being overturned in the courts. But they are likely to be challenged pretty quickly if it is one that folks want to challenge in the state. So I think that is helpful context. And again, as we go through these specific executive orders later, we'll tell you which one is which and what it means and what next steps on it will be. Last thing I'll go through this quickly is you have a lot of headlines are talking about the unprecedented speed that President Trump is signing presidential actions. He is at an unprecedented rate in modern history of signing executive actions or presidential actions. He's on pace to surpass Dwight Eisenhower as to have the most presidential actions signed by a president in modern history. Right now, he has signed 275 presidential actions. That was as of this morning. He's very likely to sign another one or two. President Eisenhower, again, holding the record as the president with the most in modern history, is at 484. And the thing I'd keep in mind here is that President Trump is competitive. He knows, he has measuring milestones in his head that he wants to achieve, especially in having a record or a historic presidency, as he often highlights in his interviews. So if he wants to break the record from Eisenhower, he'd have to sign another 215 presidential actions through the end of his term. Right now, he is well on pace to do that. As you can see on the chart on the right, he has signed the most presidential actions in the first 100 days of any president since Reagan, but even going back to Eisenhower, he has signed the most. So we expect him to continue to use the pen to pursue his agenda, given the narrow majorities in Congress. And just to give you some historical context, Obama signed 276 orders over his 2 terms. So President Trump will soon pass him, likely this week. And President Biden signed 100 executive orders in his 1 term. But Trump likely will not be the number one most presidential actions. FDR signed 3,000 or nearly 4,000 executive orders or presidential actions. See, I'm already completing the term myself. And President Wilson and President Coolidge come in second and third with 1,800 and 1,200. So we don't suspect him to sign 1,000, but I do suspect that he'll sign several hundred over the rest of his term, and will continue to again use the pen to pursue his agenda. Raina, I'll turn it back to you to go through the specific executive orders.
Sure. So we figured with the tariffs being on everybody's mind and in the news, we will start with that. And I want to caveat our conversation is that neither Trump or neither Hunter or I are experts in trade or economics. We are experts in political stuff. So we're not going to tell you what it does for your industry. You know it better than we do. But we wanted to give you some background of what is going on here in Washington. And of course, President Trump released a tariff on Canada, Mexico, and China a week ago. He has somewhat rescinded the tariff to Canada and Mexico. And now just yesterday, or I guess on Sunday, he announced that he's going to have a 25% tariff on aluminum and steel. And just judging by the announcement itself, and as Hunter was saying, the fact that it's not an executive order, it's a proclamation, we have reason to believe that this is still a moving target, and there are changes that will be made where they're kind of trying, the administration is kind of trying to figure out exactly how to structure it. And we have, as again, it just came out, so we have tried to pull some information for you. You will have a copy of this specific slide as you'll have the whole presentation. Hunter, maybe we'll skip over to the next slide. I know we have another slide on trade. And so I want to make sure that we kind of talk about what is how the president has the authority to do these tariffs. Any president, not just Trump, any president has the authority to implement tariffs if they are in case of national security. That is what is referred to as Section 232 of a congressional act that gave that authority. Of course, what constitutes national security is up for interpretation. One can make probably a more compelling argument that metals industry is part of the national security. But again, the biggest issue here is that this is very much an evolving issue. And we very much encourage you to engage with your congressional delegation and tell them how it affects you specifically. Within the Section 232, there is a very specific outline of how the president is to implement tariffs. If they're in case of national security, it engages the Department of Commerce on the economic grounds. It engages the Department of Defense on national security grounds. We are yet to see how it's going to play out and how the Trump administration will use that. My specialty comes from congressional advocacy, so I'm always advocating for folks to come and talk to their congressional delegation. However, what we are seeing now is also a direct lobbying effort with the White House. Those are usually handled by larger associations. So if you have an associations for metals manufacturing or a chamber of commerce or any of those things, they definitely may be in a position to engage with the administration. My prediction here is that we are going to see this evolve, and we're going to see exemptions for countries. We're going to see exemptions for industries, maybe negotiations in what delays, as we have seen with Canada and Mexico. So this is very much a move-in target. Hunter, do you want to add? So I know you have been pouring through the language here this afternoon, making sure we have the latest.
Yeah, so in this one, again, this goes back to the difference in the memorandum proclamation. This action, while the aluminum and tariffs being a proclamation, is immediate action to establish the tariffs on aluminum and steel. This memorandum really sets the stage for additional tariff actions. It is a broad review of all trade policies across USTR, Commerce, and Treasury, and it requires them to conduct studies or investigations into the U.S.'s annual trade deficits and goods. So that's not a specific sector or area, but just broadly why there's a trade deficit, and to identify countries to negotiate bilateral or sector-specific trade agreements, and also review existing trade agreements and make recommendations on whether the U.S. should remain in those trade agreements. So it is a broad setting of the stage for Trump to later pursue proclamations or executive orders to establish tariffs. So right now, the steel and aluminum, he was allowed to do proclamations under that, as he had done a memorandum in the past and had also established the aluminum and steel tariffs in his first administration. So he was able to continue. This memorandum now sets the stage for him to turn to other industries. Obviously, one thing that's come, for those on this call, Trump has in the past mentioned that he would pursue a tariff on copper. So that could be another area that we later see tariffs be enacted through a proclamation. And those, again, as quickly as the steel and aluminum tariffs were announced and then signed into law, he announced them on his flight to the Super Bowl, and the executive order came out a day later. or excuse me, the proclamation came out a day later. That's likely what we'll see when it comes to copper. They did in the aluminum and steel. What that was interesting when he announced it, the language is pretty clear that there are no exemptions and they're removing all past exemptions. But interestingly, if you go back and watch when he signed the proclamation, he did note that he may give an exemption to Australia because there is a trade surplus. The U.S. has a trade surplus with Australia. So TBD to if they provide that exemption, that's something to watch because it may open the door for other exemptions. But those many in the Trump administration don't prefer not to do the exemptions because again, once you do one, you got to do many. So that is something to be watching, especially as you have suppliers and or customers in areas where we have surpluses or huge deficits.
Okay, we will move on to another issue that we believe is of interest to you, the energy. And there were actually two different executive orders. One is called Unleashing American Energy. Another one is called actually declaring national energy emergency. And we'll kind of talk about both of them here, but wanted to summarize the first one. So when the president signed the Unleashing American Energy on the first day in office, it basically summarized all of the energy priorities of the Republican Party. So anything that you can think of that traditionally comes to mind, you know, supporting the traditional energy sources, fossil fuels, also geothermal, nuclear. Also, he mentioned the energy grid and the aging infrastructure. All those things kind of were laid out as we need to focus on this. This is basically sounds like they're listing all the priorities. What's notable for this group is they also did include the processing and of non-fuel materials such as rare earth minerals. This is where it's important for this industry. They are kind of putting it all together in the whole energy sector issue. The president also directed his agencies to pause any funding while they are reviewing which of the programs within agencies are quote unquote contradicting his new priorities and are actually supporting what they call the Green New Deal. That specific order or part of the order of pausing funding was overturned by the court. And that happened actually last week. And then the court doubled down again this week saying, no, you may not hold this funding back. If you are in the contract to release these funds, they must go out. You do your own review, that's fine, but the funds must go out. So that's where we are when it comes to funding. And of course, one of the other things that this executive order did is rescinded previous orders that had to do with environmental regulations or anything else that President Trump sees as counter to his priorities. In the other executive order that I mentioned, establishing national energy emergency, the specific purpose of that order was to try to sidestep any kind of environmental regulations that were slowing down energy production. And again, they are including critical minerals in this term energy, which of course is of interest to this group. They are very much, the White House is directing the Department of Energy to include funding for production of critical minerals in their funding. Now, of course, all of this is subject to congressional appropriations, but it is, we are seeing that included in his order. We put a little timeline here for you. This is the timeline for that the president is allowing for his agency to do the review of the funding and the priority. It's a pretty quick turnaround timeline, but again, the judge has said that while they are reviewing all of these things, the funds nonetheless have to go out. Hunter, what do we recommend for folks to do in this sphere?
Just a couple of things. One thing in the executive order that I think is interesting, or really two things: instructing the director of USGS to consider updating the list of critical minerals. That obviously that list of critical minerals, critical materials provides the metals, and making changes to that list provides other opportunities and has implications both when it comes to federal grants funding but also tax credits, tax incentives, and the like. So that's something for everyone on the call to be closely monitoring how that proceeds. But also the opening, requiring the Secretary of DOE to ensure that critical mineral projects, including the processing of critical minerals, receive consideration for federal support is interesting. The processing of critical minerals was always included in federal funding and support. However, extraction of minerals was not. And so that language to me suggests that they do intend to move, open that up to provide for domestic extraction and mining of minerals and metals or minerals in the United States. So that's one thing to keep an eye on. Particularly your supply chain partners here in the U.S. I do believe that they'll begin to open up. But broadly speaking, when it comes to pausing the funding, I mentioned it earlier. What we believe is that the pause is really meant to be a broad, and this is the executive order. So again, it's interagency. It's as broad as it could be. The intention was to put a pause on all funds so that the Trump administration could get a grasp and a handle of where all dollars were, so that they could determine next a path to rescinding or reclawing as much as they legally could, so that they could then turn that funding into other priorities. We actually think that that's strong upside for metals companies. They're going to take money from the EV charging stations, take that money back, and then they're going to use it to pursue other policy priorities. They've already been very vocal that critical minerals and metals processing are policy priorities, so they're likely to put that funding into those projects. And so, again, federal funding programs aren't going anywhere. Maybe they're not going to be as frequent or as maybe as much as lucrative as they were under the Biden administration, but that is a strong opportunity for metals companies in Kentucky. But for those that do have government contracts or grant agreements, what we're recommending to clients now is to begin to, again, adjust your project materials to align and demonstrate how they align to the Trump administration's priorities. How are you connected into the natural gas supply chain? How are you connected into geothermal, nuclear, consumer goods? Is your processing capacity compared to that in China? How does it increase American competitiveness? Is it in the military supply chain? Those are all things you should be highlighting. Again, while de-emphasizing some of the emissions reduction potential that were a focus for many under the Biden administration. Those are all opportunities, especially as this funding is clawed back and redistributed into minerals and metals projects, where you could pursue additional funding opportunities. And then, on the timeline, we do think that I would engage, for those that have grants and contracts, I would engage your administrators frequently just to stay up to date how that progresses. We do think the infrastructure law funds will open up more easily, more sooner. They've already seen that happen. IRA funds and programs will likely be delayed until the very end of the period. And while you do have those grants and contracts, you can do work. You just cannot request a reimbursement for that work from the federal government. There are strategies you can take to continue to work on those projects now, so that whenever the review period is over, you can hit it without losing a step. But there is a bit of a timing that you need to consider as it comes to the review period.
All right. I just want to mention one real quick thing about the energy, and Hunter, you don't need to switch the slides, but those two specific executive orders did list a number of previous executive orders having to do with environmental reviews and regulations that were overturned. If it is of interest to any of you, please reach out to us after this webinar, and we'll be happy to send that list to you and exactly what those previous executive orders did that are now no longer relevant. So one quick thing, I know we're kind of getting close to our time stamp. We wanted to mention the DEI executive order specifically because in the language of the executive order, it specifies that any entity, any private entity that receives federal grant may not have basically any semblance of a DEI type program. And what exactly DEI means, of course, is a little bit up for interpretation, and it's actually quite broadly described. I imagine this is also something that will end up in court. However, until the courts address this, or until maybe we see some changes to it, this is on the books. And in fact, we know that specifically the Department of Energy has instructed all of the folks who have grants with them to certainly pause any kind of DEI, but also pause any kind of community benefits plan activities, which of course are much broader than any kind of DEI. However, they are trying to make sure that their funding or programs are not jeopardized because they may be perceived to be going against this executive order. So we bring this up so that if you are one of those entities that has federal funding, we encourage you to stay in touch with your program officer and see if they recommend that there is a particular type of work that maybe you need to stop or you can't bill for at the time, so that there's not a question of whether you might be, for the time being, in violation of this executive order. And I think this is where we kind of come to an end when it comes to executive orders. We want to talk to you really briefly, I'm looking at the clock here, about what we can expect from Congress. And two big things really are coming out. One is the funding of the whole government for fiscal year 25. The fiscal year started in October. We do not have any of the appropriations bills done. We're operating under what is called the continuing resolution until March 14th. That is the deadline for Congress either to create new appropriations bills or extend the deadline. If that doesn't happen, the government will shut down, all the funds will stop flowing. They will be back paid after the government reopens, but it is a huge interruption. Nobody wants to see it happen. However, the last time the government was shut down was during the previous Trump administration. It was in 2018. The government stayed closed for 35 days, 5 weeks. So there is a history of tolerance of the government shutdown. So this is something we're watching here, and this is something that will affect how much Congress can get done, what the administration is doing, and that will, of course, affect anybody in this audience who is receiving any kind of reimbursement from the federal funding. Another issue that is coming up with a deadline, so to speak, is the President Trump's big tax cut package from his previous administration. Those tax cuts are expiring at the end of this year. And of course, anytime tax cuts expire, it creates a perception of there's a tax hike. So the Republican majority is very much interested in getting some of this extended. They are trying to do it through budget reconciliation, which is a specific process, aside from the fact that tax cuts, of course, are federal budget. It is a process that allows them to bypass the Senate filibuster rules, so they don't need to have 60 votes to pass it. And that issue will be very interesting for the industry because a lot of the tax incentives that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act actually could become something that is used to offset some other tax cuts. So we are watching it very closely. In fact, Congress is taking up those bills tomorrow in the committee, House and Senate. I can't remember which one is doing which tomorrow and the day after, but we are watching very closely for the folks we represent to see which one of the incentives that they're benefiting from might be jeopardized in this bill. So Hunter, I know we're like right at our time. There are some other issues we mentioned briefly here where you will have it at in a copy of your presentation. Should we turn it over to kind of final closing remarks, Hunter, and some of the questions?
Sure. Yeah, last thing on that slide of things to expect that I'd add, in addition to budget reconciliation, Congress will need to decide whether or not to use the Congressional Review Act to overturn rules from the previous administration for those that are using renewable energy credits or leveraging Section 45X, Section 48E, Section 45Y, others, whether you're installing renewable energy or you're connected in the supply chains. The Congress will have to make a decision and required by law to make a decision by March on those, whether they want to review this, to use the CRA to pursue it. So that is, an early opportunity to see their stance. Obviously, the budget reconciliation is going to be a back and forth process. So it's hard to say, even though they may start off by including repeals of those credits, where they will end up, but that is another opportunity to be watching. But in all of this is all with change. There's also opportunity. Mentioned earlier the regulatory cuts, engaging with agency, but at the congressional level, as they are looking at the Congressional Review Act window or appropriations funding, that is all opportunities to engage with your elected officials and also engage with agency staff here in DC to highlight potential projects that you have, highlight potential concerns that you have, and so that they might be addressed as they're looking at this significant change from administration to administration, but also from the new Congress. So we recommend engaging with elected officials. If you're not discussing those concerns or priorities, they're likely going to be overheard or overlooked, will not be addressed. But also engaging with elected officials on the congressionally directed spending request process. That typically opens in February, and congressional offices will take requests for congressionally directed spending into March. Obviously, with them funding the last year's appropriations bill into this year, that timeline may tip back a little bit, but we still recommend engaging now with offices to highlight potential projects that might be eligible for congressionally directed spending. If you're not familiar with that process or what that funding is, we do have a link, and we'll send it around with the deck that provides more details on how a project could be eligible and what those funds can be used for. And the last recommendation, like I said, like Irene said on the last slide, is budget reconciliation will be the largest legislative change this year. The administration and Republicans will use it to pursue their priorities, from energy to immigration, extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, changing some of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And there's going to be opportunities and challenges within that process. But with that being the largest legislative vehicle this year, beyond the annual government funding bills, that is a process to watch really closely because it will have implications for projects in Kentucky. One thing to highlight on that specifically is the New Markets Tax Credit and Opportunity Zones are both TCJA programs. Opportunity zones expire in, I believe, 2025, and the new markets expires in 2026. I may have that backwards off the top of my head, but that is something that they're going to have to look at either now in budget reconciliation for an extension, or it's something they're going to have to look at either next year or 2026 for extension. So you may have already been using the new markets tax credit or opportunity zones for your projects. If they do decide to extend the opportunity zone program, that could be an opportunity for Governor Beshear to change what opportunity zones are designated within the state of Kentucky, which might make different projects eligible for that program. But that's just something to be watching in the budget reconciliation process. If you have any questions on any of that, obviously we threw a lot of information at you, maybe some terminology you weren't familiar with. We'll be passing around this material for reference, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at any time. Our emails and phone numbers are there. So with that, I think we go to Q&A, but I did not see any questions come up in the chat as we were going.
We'll give a minute for any questions that might be coming in, and if we don't answer them now, we will try to reach back out and answer them. Hunter and Irina, thank you very much for taking time out from your busy schedule to unpack some of these topics that are important for Kentucky's metals community during what some can say very active business policy situation going around. I also want to thank everyone here for attending. Hopefully it has been informative and beneficial to you. It has been for me. This recording and the slide deck will be shared on my two website under the grants and funding section within the next 24 hours or so. As always, please feel free to reach out to us at MI2 if there's anything we can support your organization with. Again, I appreciate everybody's time and thank you. Hunter, did you see any questions come through?
No, I didn't, but just to reiterate, VJ said, thank you all for your time. And there were a lot of material at you guys. Feel free to reach out with any questions directly. We'll get back to you, but really appreciate MI2 and the opportunity to present. I think I saw some names that I recognize. Appreciate everyone's time and thank you for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'd like to.
Sorry, can I just ask one really quick question? You talked a lot about critical minerals. How do we find out what's on the list?
I'll send the link around. If you Google critical minerals, there's a list on the Department of Energy website. That's the best resource because it provides both critical minerals and critical materials, which are something different. For example, copper is a critical material, but is not a critical mineral. What defines a critical mineral is the USGS has to define that list. And the two designations between critical mineral and critical material are mean different things when it comes to federal grant, tax credit, and financing programs. If you are a critical mineral, you're essentially eligible for almost everything. If you're a critical material, you're still a focus and eligible for most things. But there are some implications for that difference when it comes to tax credits. But I recommend going to the DOE list because it tells you what is a critical mineral and a critical material. You can always reference the USGS list for critical minerals. On the executive orders, of course, mentioning that earlier, Trump is now requiring both Department of Energy and Interior, because USGS is within Interior, to update that list. So that is an opportunity for metals companies to open if you're a specific metal that is not on the critical minerals list or the critical materials list, that is an opportunity to engage, make your case for maybe why it should be. So that's one thing to highlight. And again, if you make that designation, you're eligible for more funding programs.
I'll have to look into that. Looks like somebody has a hand up, but maybe I'm misreading that. Is that Eric Gray? Is that a hand or is that something else? Might be misunderstanding that. Anyway, I want to thank everybody too. Situation on tariffs is interesting. I think almost across the board in general, metals companies will be pleased with the China tariffs on China because they're so heavily subsidized and China sends everything all over the world, as we all know. I think the tariffs on Canada and Mexico is going to be much more complex and problematic because many of our members have facilities in US, Canada, and or Mexico. So when you start moving materials around across all the borders, I really don't understand really yet on how that whole situation is going to work itself out. But I do think that that's going to be, I don't know, it's going to be difficult, and it's less straightforward than tariffs on China are, in my opinion. So I don't know what how that's going to all play out.
Yeah, and Mike, this brings up an excellent point that the story is so nuanced that I'd like to double down on my suggestion that going to the elected representatives and telling that story is very important. You know, if we just open the paper and see somebody's opinion piece, it seems to be so kind of generic, which is not, of course, the story that our companies are facing. So to the extent that we can educate our elected officials about how things are actually work and how interconnected we are and how we are affected by these tariffs, it is an excellent opportunity to do that. And I would encourage you to take advantage of it.
When it comes to Canada and Mexico, what I'd add is on the America First trade policy, the memorandum lays out this broad review of trade actions or unfair practices that are being pursued by China, particularly China, Russia, and others. That is, a lot of that language is written with Canada and Mexico specifically in mind. So we've seen a number of cases and projects that we're engaged with who have told us that, hey, China's buying operations in Canada just to close it down, buying operations in Mexico, so they're shipping metal up. Those are all things that this administration is very focused on, but it is a wide world, as they say. So understanding and raising awareness of things that you guys know about, being industry experts of maybe China is pursuing some unfair trade practice in Canada or Mexico. Now's the opportunity to be engaging with USTR and others to raise awareness around that. Because as they're doing these review periods, they want to hear it and they want to know what's going on so that they can address that. And that, in doing that, that allows USTR to be more targeted in what they're doing. Whereas right now, the Trump broadly, I should say the Trump playbook is to be as broad as possible, see what breaks, and then fix it. But I think engaging more now just to highlight we need to be more tailored and narrow in our focus so we don't hurt our own U.S. companies' supply chain is only going to smooth that process, make it more quicker.
Good deal.
All right. Well,
All right.
thank you again for
Thank you.
joining us.
Thank you very much. We look forward to talking with you more.
Absolutely. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thank
See you
you.
all.